Hi, I'm Rebecca from History, Myths and Legends, and I'm here today to talk to you about Matthew Hopkins, Witchfinder General. Now, who was Matthew Hopkins? Well, not a lot is known about him. The only documentation really comes from when he was doing his witch trials. We think he was born in 1620 in Great Wenham in Suffolk, and he was the son of a Puritan minister. And we know he had 3 brothers and he was one of 6 children. It's likely that his father's beliefs, his Puritan beliefs, were a big influence on Matthew as he was growing up. And it might be that this was one of the reasons why he turned to witch hunting, but we will never know. We know that he moved to Manningtree-in-Ness and he first took part in a witch trial in 1645. We also know that at the time it was the first English Civil War and it was a real time of unrest in the country. There was lots of superstition generally in the Fens and East Anglia, and the Puritans were part of the parliamentarian forces, and they really believed that East Anglia should be purified of evil and everyone should be godly in all ways. And this fed into that ongoing superstition of people who didn't fit in with those Puritan ideals. There was also a lot of disorder, and there was a very big economical impact on people of poverty, especially in the rural areas. So people were really surviving. And you would have individuals who were falling out with other individuals and accusing them of all sorts of things. Now, to be accused of being a witch in this time period, all you had to do was say that person is a witch, and you'd automatically be arrested and then go through the witch trials. We know that there was a witch trial in 1645, which Matthew Hopkins was his first one that he undertook with a gentleman called John Sturm. They were the investigators for this, and for Elizabeth Clark, who sadly did later hang for being a witch. But the methods that were used were pretty barbaric throughout the witch hunting trials. Mr. Hopkins and Mr. Stern, they focused on East Anglia, so they did all of their witch trials in this part of the country, but there were other witch hunters who also went around the country looking for witches as well. Matthew Hopkins had a particular interest in a book called Demonologies, which was written by the previous king, James I, who was absolutely petrified of witches. And it's thought that Matthew Hopkins used this as an almost guide to how to identify a witch and what to do with them. Now, once someone was arrested for being a witch, Hopkins used a number of methods to do the trials, which could be classed as torture nowadays. First of all, there was something called pricking, which is horrendous. Witches were suspected to have an extra nipple or a witch's mark, a devil's mark, and this would be to feed the devil or to feed what was called their familiars. So people who were arrested were examined everywhere, intimately. Their entire bodies were looked at, and anything that wasn't deemed as normal could be classed as a witch's mark. In reality, these could be things like moles, bruises, grazes. It could be anything, even prolapse or results of a sexually transmitted disease. All of these could be classed as evidence that you were a witch. And then a lady would be employed to prick all of these parts of your body to see if you bled or if it hurt, because the theory was if you were a witch, you would not feel pain and you wouldn't bleed. And people know that over time, if you are repeatedly exposed to something, like if you're pricked with a sharp object repeatedly, you will stop feeling pain. And that is just a natural way that the body reacts to it. However, this was seen as evidence that you were indeed a witch. Secondly, which is incredibly brutal, was sleep deprivation. And this is one that's written about an awful lot in documentations. He would expect the accused to walk up and down a room for hours. And I don't mean just a few hours, I mean days, 24 hours, 48 hours, even longer. They would have to walk backwards and forwards, even if they were immobile. And they were not allowed to be any rest. They just had to keep going. Now, of course, we know that sleep deprivation has side effects, People who are sleep deprived can sometimes become psychotic. They can start to become confused. They can create things that aren't there. They can see things that aren't there. And this behaviour where they would become psychotic or they would become confused would be used as evidence of their witchcraft ways. And interestingly, it was often seen by witnesses who were observing the sleep deprivation that they would see the familiars in the shadows of the people that were accused. And themselves, they could have been sleep deprived. They could have been seeing things that weren't there because they were tired, and it could have been influences of other people. So one person sees it and that hysteria goes into other people. And quite often, after being walked up and down these rooms for days on end, people just confessed because they wanted the torture to stop. It's known that Hopkins was a very persuasive man and he was a bit of a bully. So even without those two methods, he was very good at getting confessions out of people. But when you add those on top, it's not surprising that people confess to being witches. The final one, which is basically you had no chance if you were going to go through this trial, was the swimming test. And this is where you would be bound and lowered into a body of water such as a pond. If you sunk, you drowned. You were innocent. God accepted you and he took you up to heaven. If you floated, the water was rejecting you because you were a witch. So if you managed to survive it, normally you were found guilty and then hung anyway. It's a no-win situation. And lots of people went through this. Men, women, and even some younger girls. 90%, however, of people accused of being witchcraft were indeed women, which is terrible. Hundreds and hundreds of people were accused over the years of witchcraft. Now he and Stern used to go up and down the country, and they used to charge towns to purge their town of witches, and they used to earn very well out of it. And because of the Civil War, courts weren't really properly organised or working as they would normally do. And any witch who was found that they needed to go to trial found themselves in very hastily set up, very amateur courts, very quickly turned around and, very short trials, and they were often found guilty. We don't know how many women were executed and men who were executed as a result of Hopkins and Stern, but we do know that there were hundreds who were hung. Now, over the years, Hopkins and his assistant John Stern, the tide started to change. People started to feel a little bit uncomfortable with the methods that he used. And as the Civil War started to come to an end in 1646, King Charles was imprisoned, the parliamentarians won, and the court started to return back to normal. The Second Civil War hadn't yet started, and people were sort of really looking at people like witch hunters, like John Stern and Matthew Hopkins, and they started to think, actually, this doesn't feel quite right with us. Matthew Hopkins, in response, wrote a pamphlet or a book called The Discovery of Witches. And this really justified why he was doing what he was doing. And this was published in 1647. Now, a few months after it was published, he actually passed away in 1647. And it's thought that he got tuberculosis and passed away. He was only in his 20s when he died, and he made such an impact on East Anglia. He called himself the Witchfinder General. That wasn't a title that was given to him by anyone. That was a self-proclaimed title. But he was a witchfinder, as were many other people around the country. John Stern retired from witch hunting, but he did write a very helpful book for us, because a lot of the documentation that he wrote actually outlines where a lot of the witches were investigated, which I'll go into in another video. Now, sadly, Matthew Hopkins did create a bit of a legacy, because his book, The Discovery of Witches, is thought to have been the inspiration behind the American witch hunts. So the New England and the Salem witch trials, which happened over in America. It's thought that they used The Discovery of Witches as a guide on how to torture men and women to discover if they were witches, because that's the reality, they were tortured. So he left a lasting stain globally with the actions that he did. And it's quite thankful in a way that he did pass away in his 20s, because you can imagine what would have happened if he'd continued. Or would the public actually have gone, this isn't right, and would have put a stop to it? Like I said, it's not known how many witches were executed during his time, but it is thought between the 15th and 17th century that 500 witches documented were hung, and there could have been anything up to 1,000 witches who were executed over that time. And in England, witches were hung. You weren't burnt at the stake unless you'd been found guilty for another crime, such as treason or heresy. So that's my whistle-top tour of Matthew Hopkins. There's lots of information online. Do look him up, because it's an interesting story from our past, and a very big tragedy, really. And I will be going over some more videos on why were people accused of witchcraft soon. Thank you. Have a good day. Goodbye.